once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
It's showtime.
Indeed it is. It's showtime. Here we go. It's the Monday edition of On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, the daily edition. If you're just catching up with this, yes, we've gone from weekly during the writ period to Monday to Friday, and we try to record these later in the day, given, all of the stuff that's been going on, just not on the campaign trail, but we're keeping an eye on how it's affected by the Ottawa affairs, the leadership race for the Liberals, and Saturday was a tariff-fying day, although we had, I guess February 2nd came and the groundhog came out of his hole. We're not quite sure whether they're going to get 6 months or 6 years worth of tariffs. So we'll get into a little bit of that. But as we record this, there is a meeting pending between Prime Minister Trudeau and President Trump. So again, a lot will be happening in the next hour as we go. All right, let's get to the crew around the table. Keith Leslie joining us, of course, a longtime contributor and partner here at On the Ledge. Tim Hudak is the former PC Ontario leader and a partner now at Council Public Affairs. And happy to welcome in for the first time Monique Smith from Global Public Affairs. But Monique, let's start with you just because I want your perspective. We were talking last week just in terms of, what would go into the show and your role at one point as being Ontario's representative in Washington. So you've got a particular perspective on the election campaign, but also, what the hell's playing out in real life, terrifying time between Washington and Ottawa.
Indeed, it is a terrifying time in Washington, Ottawa, and all across Canada. I was in Washington for 5 years. I was Ontario's first representative there. I spent a great deal of time talking to Americans about Canadian trade, Ontario trade, talking about tariffs and their impact on Canadians. I remember the morning well when Trump first initiated tariffs on aluminum and steel, and we all just kind of woke up and went, what? Why? Where? It was completely out of the blue, completely unexpected in the embassy by anyone who was working on the trade file. It really was focused on China, but Trump had determined that steel was coming in through the back door of Canada, and he was going to stop it. Again, no real consultation with Canada, no real telegraphing that it was going to happen. It just happened, and so now at least we find ourselves in very much similar waters, although to a much greater extent, but with a little bit of a timeline to prepare or somewhat prepare. And it seems a little bit of room to negotiate as the president and prime minister talked this morning and are going to talk again this afternoon before tariffs are to come into play tonight at midnight. So,
well, before we get to the other guys, I just want to get your sense of the change in the tone here, Monique, because you just said, well, wow, that came out of the blue. In this case, we've seen it coming. In this case, we knew the number was big. It was going to be 25%. In this case, we seem to think that there's an appetite for it south of the border politically in terms of supporting the president, where before, there was some pressure for him to push back on these things. Do you get a sense of the difference and what that's going to mean for us?
I don't think Americans are aware of what it's going to mean for them. I think they're starting to. I think we're starting to see that over the weekend. We saw some of the American political conversations turning to how this is going to impact Americans in their pocketbook, on their day-to-day lives. And I think that is going to have an impact on the president, although he keeps trying to kind of fluff it off as short-term pain. But I think there is certainly, there's a whole different tenor to this administration than the first Trump administration. We used to kind of look at their transition and think, is it never going to end the first time? This time they came in guns a-blazing, ready for action, having spent the last 4 years preparing for what they hoped would be another kick at the can, and they are taking full advantage of it. So I think Canadians have to brace themselves for a roller coaster with their American neighbors for the next 4 years, and certainly we're seeing that in spades in the first 2 weeks.
Yeah, Tim, it was a real buckle up moment. Just your, what kind of a grade were you giving the Prime Minister and his team with their response on Saturday night?
Pretty solid. Pretty solid. I thought the tone was right. It was with reluctance, sadness, not in anger, but serious. It appears to me, Dave, did their homework in terms of what the retaliatory measures, would be, strategically targeted at states that have influential Republicans in them, and put some pressure there. And then that was followed by some provincial actions, including Premier Ford here in Ontario, saying we're going to take the American-based alcohol off the shelves of the LCBO altogether. Look, I think that there is, I'll tell you my alternative plan later if you like, but I think what we need to do here is first, you stand up and show that you're serious. I think if we caved in right away, Trump would simply ask for more. But then you do what appears to be happening today, you negotiate. Fentanyl seemed to be out of the blue in terms of a Canadian-American issue, but certainly, trading off with more investments in defense, tearing down interprovincial trade barriers, allowing more investment in highly regulated sectors, and hopefully a stronger immigration system. I'll argue, David, those trade-offs are actually good for Canadians.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's one of these things. If nothing else, it's certainly sharpened our attention here in terms of if not there, then where, and certainly good idea to look at home. And of course, the news today from the Premier on the campaign trail, building on your note, Tim, that is to say to remove American liquor from the stores at the LCBO.
Starting today and until U.S. tariffs are removed, Ontario is banning American companies from provincial contracts. Every year, the Ontario government and its agencies spend $30 billion in procurement, alongside our $200 billion plan to build Ontario. And I'm urging all 444 municipalities to do the same. U.S.-based businesses will now lose out on tens of billions of dollars in new revenues. They only have President Trump to blame. We've gone one step further. We'll be ripping up our contract with Elon Musk's Starlink. Ontario won't do business with people hell-bent on destroying our economy.
Well, and a good tone, right? I think there, Keith, but really amped it up based on the posture that Tim described the Prime Minister taking on Saturday. This is aggressive, and it may be playing well only because he started this whole thing by saying how disappointed he was in the president.
Oh, he does every time, and he starts with, God bless America, and I love Americans, and I have business, and, he really does. But he hit it bang on there. That's exactly what people wanted to hear, especially about that Elon Musk contract, that $100 million contract with Starlink. Rip that up. And why? Because this is Donald Trump's fault. And who's got Donald Trump's ear? Elon Musk. So that alone will get through to Trump. And I noticed Chrystia Freeland came up with an idea I talked about before. I talked about putting a tariff on Teslas, an import duty on Teslas. She wants 100% duty on Teslas, just like we put on the Chinese EVs. These are the kind of things that will get Musk's attention and thus far get Trump's attention. I think Doug Ford, though, is playing it masterfully. I mean, election or not, I know he's campaigning on the taxpayers' dime, but this is exactly what people want to hear. And again, taking $1 billion of American product out of the LCBO, not just the stores. That means restaurants and bars can't restock. No American liquor products are coming through the LCBO, which distributes everything. And most of the other premiers have said the same thing in their liquor stores. American products are just coming off the shelves. It's not as if we're going to be told to buy Canadian. We can buy Italian wines, we can buy Spanish. Anyway, there's lots of options out there. And if you don't get your Kentucky bourbon, try some Irish whiskey. There's lots of options, and I think that's what Canadians are going to do. But I think for the most part, Premier Ford, as you asked about at the beginning, he's really hitting the right tone, and this is what Canadians need to see us do: stand up firmly, and maybe even, with an edge. You have to have some edge with it, even though we regret having to take this tone. But God damn it, we can't stand for this.
Dave, I would just point out that Bonnie Crombie did firmly demand that we tear up that contract with Elon Musk last week. So it wasn't like a brainchild of the
oh no, it wasn't
there.
They were responding to criticism. Absolutely,
there was lots of criticism of that. Yeah, and I also noted that there's restaurateurs who are taking the American listings off their menus. So I do believe that we're starting to see a real full frontal, all Canada, on side for this. I thought, just to Tim's point of the Prime Minister's speech on Saturday night, which I waited up for and tuned in Saturday night at 9. I thought it was a good speech. I thought he hit the right tone, and I actually loved the juxtaposition between him and his reasoned approach, saddened, going over the history of our shared past and how Canada's always been there for Americans. And then we flip to the news and we see where, real life Canadians are booing the American national anthem. I thought it gave both that diplomatic and that guttural reaction to how we feel we're being treated by the Americans in this.
Yeah, I want you to, respond to that, Tim, because I've heard people, in media this morning, particularly Thomas Mulcair was just, beside himself to the idea that we Canadians would boo the national anthem. And I thought, you know what? Sometimes the bully to stop him needs a good kick in the nuts just to slow him down. And if that's our way of expressing it, you know what? Go for it. I get that it's un-Canadian for sure. And maybe that's why it catches people by surprise. We got you on mute there, pal.
It really is. It's human nature, even if not necessarily Canadian nature. I do where we could go a bit too far, but I understand how people can react that way at a game. This is a good opportunity for me to present my alternative, right? Like, what do you do when you're confronted by a bully? One theory is you stand up to the bully. The other one is you join the bully and pick on somebody smaller. So we could also position our troops to go after Greenland, Dave. That's my alternative that I want to put on the table here today, and send our Navy to Panama while we're at it.
Oh my God.
You're laughing.
Signing up to the left. There we go.
There was video just before that video of the weekend of the different sporting events. There was video posted from, I think it was about 10 years ago at Maple Leaf Gardens, where the woman singing the American anthem lost her mic and cut out, and the entire arena finished the American anthem full-throated all the way through. So that's how we normally really feel. That
for sure.
American, we're stepping in. We're right there.
Well, and I think it gets their attention.
Yeah.
Right? Getting Americans' attention that we're not happy and there's something you should maybe take note of. And I thought that, the American stations yesterday morning, the talking heads on Sunday morning, we're talking about this. We're talking about Canadians booing the national anthem and they're upset. And suddenly Americans are looking, going, why are we upsetting Canadians? This makes no sense. And that's the point. It makes no sense.
So one of the things that we heard in the Premier's conversation was he was encouraging other municipalities across the province to do the same as the province is doing vis-a-vis procurement and contracts. And I thought it was interesting that Mayor Chow got out in front of that based on the work they're doing right now with the Toronto budget.
I've instructed the city manager to immediately coordinate with our federal and provincial counterparts so that we respond with one voice confronting this economic attack. Through this coordination, the City of Toronto, with its $78 billion budget, will have a Toronto Action Plan. The action plan includes a Buy Canadian initiative, a citywide push to put our locally made products and services first. It includes a review of the city government's procurement policies and contracts. And we invite other municipalities across the GTA, Ontario, and Canada to join together and do a Buy Canadian, Team Canada policies.
You're probably looking for a music bed there at the end, Keith, just to sort of play her out a little bit. But I think the sentiment is interesting. Two things. I think it's important that she show some leadership vis-a-vis government, standing aside government, whatever level it is or whatever party alignment it might be. The second thing is it may well be symbolic, but this is the largest municipal government in the country. So if anybody's going to do it, it should be Toronto.
Absolutely. And let's face it, it's larger than many provinces as far as its budget goes. So this is crucially important that a municipality the size of Toronto take this kind of lead. I think what we saw, though, and I think this is one of the issues I covered for years that never made any traction, the same as the high-speed rail has been studied since I had my entire career, and that's interprovincial trade tariffs or trade barriers. We're talking, we're just trading within Canada now, how we're going to finally address this, finally the Chamber of Commerce come out with a statement saying that basically the interprovincial trade barriers amount to about a 21% tariff that we impose on each other's products totally. So there's one area where we could absolutely pretty much offset the threatened 25% or the actual 25% that kicks in at midnight that Trump is putting on most of our products. So there's some options for us. And finally, I mean, there's been so much talk, as I say, I can't remember how often I've covered this. I covered a whole lot of premiers' conferences, Council of the Federation, where this would come up and just get pushed aside. Everyone's passionate about it, but no one would actually do it. So I think that's going to be something we really have to work on. And something else is going to be, there's been a lot of talk about, the oil and gas in Alberta and the auto sector in Ontario. They're coming after supply management. Trump was at it again today about eggs and milk and this kind of stuff, and we don't take their agricultural products. They're coming after supply management, and that's going to be a tough sell in Quebec. So Canada's got a huge fight on its hands, and I think showing them that you've declared economic warfare on us. And so we have to stand up and do as best we can. But I don't think in the end, I don't know if we have the capacity to manage them dollar for dollar. So we really have to get to the negotiations and get some actual negotiations going on, not just through the media with Trump.
So two things, Tim. If there was a note of optimism today at all in terms of the way this is playing out, there seems to be a sort of a realignment in terms of the conversation with Mexico this morning. So, there seems to be some give and take there, and it opens up the door to say, well, okay, Canada's had a conversation already. The Prime Minister's coming back. We're going to meet again later in the afternoon. I had some questions. One of the things that the president pointed out was, do you know that we can't have American banks in Canada? And so, he wants that on the table, and he's being very, overt about it. And these are things that hadn't been on the table in terms of conversations prior to this. So we can say everything's on the table, but do we really want everything on the table?
I think it's a good time to actually re-examine some of the long-standing barriers we have to choice, to competition, and investment in Canada that ultimately will create more jobs and hopefully better costs for consumers. Look, I'll remain the optimist as I have been since we started this coverage. Dave, it is a roller coaster. There's going to be some tremendous ups and downs. There'll be lots of twists and turns on a daily basis. Like as we record this, who knows what's going to happen by the time we put our heads down to bed tonight, right? But fentanyl was a phantom, right? This whole notion of the 25% tariffs based on all the fentanyl pouring across border in the States, I think was just Trump's excuse to trigger these emergency tariff powers. It made more sense. So why I'm feeling more optimistic today than yesterday, because now we're turning to what the real issues and grievances are. I'll reinforce it involves actually opening up more competition and choice, doing more in defense, and actually having a serious immigration priorities for our country. Ultimately, that's good.
Well, Monique, I saw an interesting piece on the weekend, and it was written by an adjunct professor at Indiana University, and his specialty is negotiating. And he talked about Trump's approach. His posture is there will always be a winner or there will always be a loser. And that's his only way of dealing with this. And it clashes significantly in a world where we're talking about an integrated economy. We need integrated negotiation. So I don't know who gives or takes in that. But to Tim's point, you need to know what the rules are. You need to know what the ask is. And in the last 48 hours, the ask keeps changing.
The ask keeps changing, and there's no rhyme or reason as to why he's doing this. I mean, his own media is questioning why he's doing this. The Wall Street Journal came out with an article, the New York Times, they're all like, why Canada? Why are we doing this? Now, in his most latest press conference, which was happening just before we came together, he's starting to talk about going after the EU. So that'll get the attention of the Europeans in a pretty quick manner. But I do think that I agree with Tim that there's some hope that we can see some, a little bit of a pause given what's happened with Mexico. Perhaps we can see a similar pause with Canada if we move forward. I mean, it seems that the pause with Mexico was brought upon by the Mexican president, who is a female, by the way. And I would just point out, because I listened to your broadcast last week, that Doug Ford's assertions that, no one can come up against Trump except him, and that Merritt Stiles and Bonnie Crombie are not qualified, has been proven very wrong this afternoon, with the female president of Mexico being able to put a little pause on the tariffs while others are still struggling. So I would just point that out point for the women and go back to, I think your point that we don't know what the rules are, we don't know what the asks are very much a challenge for Canadian negotiators because we're negotiating against ourselves. I mean, we saw the ambassador in the media, the Canadian ambassador to the U.S., Kirsten Hillman, who is a seasoned trade negotiator, in the U.S. media this week saying, like, we just want to know what the end game is. We want to know what he wants. We want to know what we're negotiating towards. No one seems to understand.
Well, Keith, we're negotiating with somebody on the Trump side who hasn't yet been confirmed.
Oh, well,
not,
last time, listen, when we did UXMA or the NAFTA renegotiation, we had no idea who was in charge of the negotiations. Neither did the Americans. We had American Congress people asking Canadians what they were hearing about the negotiations because they didn't know if it was the Secretary of Commerce or the trade negotiator who really had the pen. It was a very much a whole moving target kind of negotiation at the time. I think they're a bit more focused this time. It's just, I don't know how many people on the U.S. side actually know what the end game is. Sorry, Keith, I talked over you.
No, that's quite all right. That's quite all right. My concern is, as you said, the ask keeps changing. Well, one thing that he didn't threaten Mexico or China with was an attack on their sovereignty or a suggestion that they become a state. And still, he still keeps spewing this stuff. And I know we want to make as little of it as possible and say it's just part of the negotiating tactic. But I think that's what's fired up most Canadians more than anything. And he did it again yesterday. And he was talking about how, if they didn't subsidize to, I think he's up to $300 billion a year now, that Trudeau told him Canada would not be an economically viable country. Well, he's literally declaring war on our sovereignty with this kind of talk. And as I say, I think that's what's fired up most Canadians more than anything. I mean, the tariffs are one thing, but this kind of talk about coming at us with the 51st state stuff, it's not a joke. It's beyond insulting. And as I say, it's one of the few unifying things that Canada has right now. So I think that's why the Team Canada approach is going to work. But for the most part, trying to figure out what the hell Donald Trump wants from one hour to the next is a mug's game. And even for the media, I mean, we all vowed after last time, we learned in the first Trump presidency, and he learned too, that anything he says, no matter if he goes on all damn day, will get jumped on and covered by all the media, the mainstream and all the new media types, social media and different platforms. He can't lose. His platform is forever. And he's, as Monique said, and he discussed today about the European Union trade deficit being $350 billion. So he's going after them as well. So it's not just Canada, but back to my first point, Canada, other than Greenland and the Panama Canal, Canada is the only neighbor that he's actually threatened with. We'd like your land because we know that you've got, and we know what he really wants. The same with the Greenland. He wants critical minerals and he wants our water.
Tim, the whole conversation seems absurd, in the extreme, but the more keeps saying it, the more concerning it gets because he keeps repeating it. Over the weekend, and I'm sure you heard, and I saw the Economist piece on it as well, the whole question, okay, now there's joining the United States is one thing, joining the EU is another thing. And there are problems with that geographically and based on the constitution of the European Union and so on. But, it sort of opened up the conversation where we were talking earlier about provincial trade barriers, that we really should be looking at opportunities where we can strengthen our trade, where we can strengthen our economic connections. And that's a good place to do it. And I realize the current free trade agreement in Europe is phasing itself in, but does that accelerate it at all? Or does that change the complexion of this conversation?
Yeah, a few issues on the table, and I'll link it back to Olivia Chow's video earlier on as well. I still don't like. There's the expression you need to take Trump seriously, but don't take him literally. I don't believe that the Republicans would want to add Canada into their electoral college, a country that voted for Trudeau 3 straight times. Are you kidding me? They don't want us anywhere near an American ballot. So I don't buy that. I think it's a way of belittling actually our prime minister. I don't take it seriously. I actually take Greenland seriously. The American economy is so huge. I can make every Danish person super rich to hand over Greenland. I think that might be something that actually does happen. Look, the fact is that I don't think Trump actually has a grand strategy here. I think he likes the attention. He likes putting pressure on us. And as long as we give him something he can describe as a win, he could sell anything to the red hat crowd. So maybe it's actually an opportunity for us to put some of the things on the table we discussed. He can call it a win, and we move forward together. To Olivia Chow, what I worried about there is, as I mentioned earlier, I thought that Prime Minister Trudeau's tone was on the money. More sadness than an anger, but serious. I worry that some politicians might look a little too joyous. Trump is a great villain to go after. He can appeal to anti-Americanism in Canada. So I think we need to be careful of too much energy on the angry side. And I do hope some of that energy actually goes to what can we put on the table that will benefit Canadians at the end of the day, including knocking down interprovincial trade barriers.
So, Tim, I would say that your leader is in Ontario the most joyous about fighting Trump, because that's the whole reason why he called this election. That's the whole reason why we're in this mess. And I would argue that part of the reason that we're not getting to interprovincial trade negotiations. And Keith, I totally hear you. We talked about it at the Council of the Federation in 2013. I was there. And here it is, 2025. We're still having that same conversation. But if we were to seriously have a conversation about interprovincial trade, we'd need all the premiers to have their heads in the game. Being in the middle of an election, an unnecessary election, an election that's purely opportunistic and solely called in order to gain a 4-year mandate, is not helpful to Ontarians or to the rest of Canada in negotiating any interprovincial trade agreements. So I would just put that out there as one of the many, many reasons why we shouldn't be in a provincial election right now.
Yeah, look, and we are, right. So that is the reality to it. I can see if it supports the Protect Ontario plan, I can see the Premier pivoting towards addressing some of these barriers. Ontario's usually been one, as you know, Monique, from your own service in caucus and in cabinet, been one of the leaders to try to knock down these barriers. But yeah, and I think Premier Ford's tone is usually right. Like when you saw him on CNN the other night or in Fox, I think he's hitting the tone very well. Sometimes, he might go to 11, like talking about cutting off electricity to the states. I think that's not where you want to go at this point in time. But in terms of how this campaign is shaping up, I'd agree, Monique. I think that Doug Ford will get a lot more votes from Ontarians than Donald Trump.
So, Keith, let's just flip it up to Ottawa for a second, because, Chrystia Freeland was very quick to respond, and Mark Carney's been talking about this off and on, and being the two front runners for the Liberal leadership and the Prime Minister's chair in the next few weeks. Does Doug Ford's presence on that stage actually overwhelm everything that they are attempting to do, or are they playing into the same kind of game?
Well, I think it's to Ford's advantage, again. I mean, that we have this leadership vacuum in Ottawa, that we have a leadership race going on with the federal Liberal Party. Are we still considering that there's two front runners? I thought it was a Carney coronation with Chrystia Freeland running a respectable second, but not really in a position any longer to claim she's going to have a fighting chance to win that leadership. That could be me misinterpreting the scene that I'm seeing right now, but it seems Carney's way out in front there. To your point, though, Dave, it's hard for them to get any traction on this issue because it's the Prime Minister's job, and he's still in the job, and his cabinet is still there. They're not running for the leadership. They're out there dealing with this this Trump issue, as is Doug Ford, and the whole Captain Canada thing, as we've discussed, especially with a hard hat and a vest. Doug Ford just couldn't be more in his element, and it's really working for him. And to the point, to round it back sort of to Ontario politics and the Ontario election, how on earth are the NDP and Liberal leaders, Bonnie Crombie and Merritt Stiles, how on earth are they supposed to get in these stories about what they would do to try and protect us from Trump's tariffs when they're basically national stories? There's no room for the Ontario opposition parties to get into this. So this really, really plays for Doug Ford. And I think nationally as well, it's the rest of Canada, they've heard about Doug Ford, and they maybe, knew about him a little bit. They've watched him, and his performance seems pretty bang on with with the way most Canadians are feeling about what Donald Trump has done here. So I think all of this seems to play, for the most part, to Doug Ford's advantage.
So interesting. Before we got on, and I've got 1,000 things going on. I thought, everything's happening so quickly. So I sat down with Erin this morning, my daughter, and she's the CEO at Story Studio Network, and she is big into the use of AI and Chat GPT. So I said, I need to stay on top of all of this stuff, and Google doesn't do it for me. So she showed me how to actually send out, commands to Chat GPT and find the most up-to-date stories on the 3 or 4 campaigns that are going on with the Greens, the NDP, and so on, right up to the Premier's campaign. And I said, I set it at certain hours, and at noon hour, boom, they all come flying in. And the Premier he must have had a dozen different angles on the story. Crombie had 4 or 5. Stiles had 4 or 5. Mike Schreiner had 1 or 2. But what I found remarkable, Tim, is that most of the stories that came up around the NDP and the Liberal campaign were 3 days old.
Yeah.
That was to me a suggestion of how the media is handling this. They're putting the media is putting the premier first, as opposed to the other two opposition leaders in terms of deadlines and urgency around the storytelling.
Yeah, I mean, hence my joke that only Keith laughed at, but I thought it was funny. It's if you came in and watched this campaign outside Ontario, you'd think it's Doug Ford against Donald Trump, right? Those are the two candidates that have been running the last couple of days. But I've been there as an opposition leader. It is awfully hard to cut through. But at least when a campaign comes on, you get a stage and you get some light on you to drive your message. And whether you agree that there should be a campaign now or not, whether the mandate to be sought is legitimate or not, boy, tactically, this is a huge advantage to the Progressive Conservatives and Doug Ford. Because when Bonnie Crombie got off the strong message on healthcare in the opening day, Marit Stiles got hers out there about 407 tolls. Since then, it's been all Trump, all Ford, and really hard for the opposition leaders to get any time.
Well, I mean, let's face it, the news is all Trump right now, and it has been since Friday, the countdown to Saturday. Dave, you're as guilty as anyone. You showed a clip of Doug Ford in his little vest or whatever the hell he was wearing today, fighting for the little guy. I didn't see it. I haven't yet. Maybe you've got one up.
Show ain't over, Monique. Show ain't over.
Show ain't over, but we haven't seen any clips of Bonnie or Merritt yet, and I think we should. So, but I mean, Tim, you're totally right. And that's why he called the election right now. He's been looking for an excuse for a year. I mean, last week you were kind in saying that he has been preparing the electorate. This is not a snap election. This is an early election, and he's been preparing the electorate. No, he has been waiting for an excuse. And this is the excuse that he's finally got to go to the polls and get himself a unneeded mandate. I mean, unneeded on two fronts. He's got 16 months left in this mandate, more than enough time to negotiate, to quote unquote, negotiate on behalf of Ontario. Secondly, he's not negotiating on behalf of Canada. Ontario is one of 13 provinces and territories in Canada. We have one national leader who is fighting on behalf of Canada, who will be talking to the President of the United States in 16 minutes. That is the leader of the country who is leading this fight. Do I think that provinces have a role to play? Yes. Did we have a role to play when I was down there? Absolutely. Mostly talking to governors, talking to the states where we had a bigger impact than on a national level. But this is all staged. This is all one big Doug Ford show. And I think it's unfortunate that the mainstream media is focusing on his big performance on this trade negotiation when we should be talking about healthcare and education and wait times, lack of doctors. And sorry, Keith, go ahead.
I interrupted you. Why is Trudeau giving him the national stage? Why is it Doug Ford that's on all the American networks, on Fox, on CNN? Because he knows he can get a message to Americans, which he really wants to do, but he also can get as many Canadian eyeballs as he can doing any Canadian interview. Doug Ford has not done interviews with the Queen's Park Press Gallery since he got elected for the most part. He's never been on Steve Paikin's show, for goodness sakes. Every premier does that one at least. He hasn't done that, but he'll do all these American networks, as they say, because he knows he's getting a huge Canadian audience with that, and he's getting through to the Americans. But why isn't Prime Minister Trudeau out doing all those interviews with all those Americans? I assure you the networks would rather be talking to a prime minister than a premier who they're not even sure where he fits in the thing. They called him a Canadian government official yesterday on CNN.
Oh, no.
So, this really should be Trudeau's thing to be doing. Or conversely, come back to the provincial election. Monique, you have a very valid point. And the TV networks had better be very, very careful here, because they are absolutely supposed to be giving equal time to Merritt and Bonnie, the opposition parties, and Mike Schreiner, as we go through an actual writ period. So that doesn't seem to be being done right now. But again, it's hard for anyone to argue that Donald Trump is setting the news agenda for, well, the world, or certainly Canada and North America at this point, and certainly
For sure.
today.
And while Canadian networks have an obligation, whether they fulfill it or not, for equal time, CNN does not. Fox News does not.
No.
And this is a master stroke of tactics, whether you like it or not, to really dominate the cycle, squeeze out the other parties. And Dave, and Keith, Monique know this as well, right? You plan out every day of the campaign, your backdrop. How does that reinforce your message? Only Doug Ford can do a backdrop of the White House, and he'll do that, I bet, at least 2 times in this campaign.
Well, he's going twice on taxpayers' dime during an election, which some would argue is not legal, but there you have it. We can debate that one next week.
Well, and again, we flippantly throw around the phrase, the campaigns are not the time to talk about important issues, and that's one of them. I mean, clearly that's an issue that should be talked about, but gets pushed. Here's my question, and I think if there's a tactic by the opposition, they have to be able to take what's in front of them. That is the situation vis-a-vis Trump and tariffs, and turn it into their narrative on the campaign trail. And I'll take up your challenge, Monique, because I think today Bonnie Crombie did it well.
We would have been working closely with all the premiers to present a united front to our counterparts in the South. We would be at our desks working today rather than calling a snap election in the dead of winter, hoping to secure another mandate when you already have a majority government and can govern until June of 2026.
And that's the narrative in Ottawa, right? If we're really going to get any of this accomplished, we need the government to sit and actually put legislative muscle behind what it is we're complaining about and the measures we want to take. And I know politically in Ottawa, that's not going to happen because there's a fear that the Tories will defeat the Liberals and so on, and that'll get lost in the scramble. But the message is, Keith, I think the right one. Like, we should be working. We should be at our desk right now working the problem.
Absolutely. But, you don't need everyone working the problem when you've got Doug Ford out solving it all for us. And that's essentially the message we're being given, isn't it? That the legislature is almost irrelevant. When Ford was pushed and they said, well, if I have to, I can recall the cabinet and we can, take any action we need to take right away, which is technically true. But it does point to, and I think Monique's point and many others have made it, it is very, very valid. This election was not necessary other than to secure Doug Ford another 4-year mandate when he's got 16 months left in his current mandate and a very large majority with which he could do whatever he wanted in the legislature. The legislature should be sitting right now. But he's not only, not running a campaign platform. He said, well, the details will be in the budget. Well, there won't be a budget presented before the legislature resumes either. So this is a way of Doug Ford playing the system again. You can't blame him. The system is set up there for premiums to take advantage of it, but he's absolutely making it clear that this is all on him and that the legislature is almost irrelevant to the cause of Ontario's big projects, such as the huge, they're spending $200 billion on infrastructure projects, all these sorts of things that he doesn't really want to debate because, if he gets in the legislature and starts having to take questions every day on hospitals, on shortage of family doctors, and overcrowding ERs, and hallway healthcare, as well as homelessness and the housing file that they've so tremendous. They've just blown the housing file, which is their signature file. They can't build homes for some reason. So there's a lot of vulnerabilities there. But it's just going to keep him. Donald Trump seems to be just playing right into Doug Ford's hand, and I think we're going to continue to see that.
Well, Tim, the idea of the budget, I think to me right now is a red herring, because if he had put a budget on the table, last week and they were still sitting, the budget would mostly be meaningless in terms of how do you actually deal with the outcome or the effects of the tariffs, because we still don't really know how they're going to play out. So the budget has to be a response to the tariffs and what we see in terms of the landscape. No?
Oh yeah, for sure. And then, programs to adjust to the impact and actions to accelerate investments in infrastructure, job creation, et cetera, as a counterbalance. But look, I'd be the contrarian here. I think if you have a cover story and you stick to it, you can carry it through an election campaign. We often talk about David Peterson, but I don't think this is Peterson deja vu all over again. John Chrétien successfully had an early election and defeated Stockwell Day. And in Nova Scotia, Tim Houston talked about a better deal on healthcare, a better deal for the federal government, and stuck to it. I think you can. And I believe that enough Ontarians will find it plausible that with the most unpredictable person in the White House that can threaten our interests, having a premier who's there as long will pass the sniff test. Bottom line on this one, I think every time that Bonnie Crombie is talking about managing the Trump thing better than Doug Ford, I think is a losing day. If you were talking healthcare or education, these things that are being ignored, that should be more successful. Marit Stiles has spent a lot of time contrasting with the two leaders and not enough about what the NDP would do differently. I'm the contrarian here. I think the more they talk about Trump, the more they're helping Doug Ford.
Well, but the more they just talk about healthcare and all those issues, it gets ignored because we're talking about Trump, though, Tim.
Sadly, I mean,
you got to try to drive that as cleverly as you can, and in social media, and go outside the press, call the press out on it. I could be wrong. I just think if you're saying that I could manage Trump better than Doug Ford in the situation, it's going to be tough unless he screws up.
On the other side, Monique, what the premier's doing, I know it'll gall you to admit it, but it's pretty good politics.
but you know what happens tomorrow? What happens at 3:00 if Trump says, okay, let's put the tariffs on hold for 30 days? That takes us through to the end of the election. What is Ford going to be fighting about? I mean, if we get the tariffs put on hold, which is a possibility, we're seeing it happening in Mexico, and tomorrow's panel will have a whole different discussion happening. But if we do, then where does Ford go? Then do we get to talk about healthcare? Then do we get to talk about the fact that, you know, people can't find doctors? Then do we get to talk about the $1 billion spa at Ontario Place? Then do we get to talk about the $1 billion cost of putting beer in the freaking corner stores? Who cares? Like, there are so many things going on in this province that need to be addressed, that need to be the focus. And I think, you know, we've got a federal government that's doing its best to negotiate, to figure out what Trump wants, and to represent Canada. I don't discount that provinces have a role, but it should not be the only role, and it should not be the focus of this election.
Well, on the NDP side of things, though, and I think they're trying again to be focused on the outcomes and the effects, anticipated effects of the tariffs. And, you know, Marit Stiles was doing her thing around protecting particularly, union jobs in the province.
First, we have to defend jobs and look after our people. And here's how we're going to do that. We're going to work with Ontario employers, workers, and their unions to defend auto jobs right here in Ontario and all across the province, Oshawa to Windsor and everywhere else. We're going to do the same for all trade-exposed industries, providing direct support, creating new supply chains, very important, and finding new export markets to keep workers employed as we deal with the shock of these tariffs.
Keith, the thing about all of this, as we've heard it unfold, and I think the most complicated discussion will always be around the auto industry. The energy is pretty cut and dry. You can see how that would play on both sides of the border. We can talk about our bourbon and our wine and all of those things. But the complications around the Ontario relationship with the United States vis-a-vis the auto sector, I think really is at the heart of a lot of what's going to go on here. And here's what worries me. That's kind of being pushed to the side a little bit with all the other shiny things that are going on. And I, living in Ontario, yeah, I'm going to feel it. But the whole country's going to feel it when the auto sector gets hit.
Well, apparently from what the experts are saying, excuse me, the auto sector is going to get hit really quickly. And it's because of the just-in-time delivery. I mean, the auto pact is older than I am, for God's sakes. It goes back to 1965 or 64. It's a crucial thing between Canada and the United States, and it's almost representative of how good a relationship we have as far as our economies being intertwined. They talk about how many times that car part passes back and forth before the finished vehicle. But what's going to happen here? We've already heard GM has said they've got a plan to deal with Trump's tariffs, and what does that mean? And I suspect it means they're manufacturing everything in the United States like he wants. But in the short term, if these plants start being shut down within a week or 10 days because of the just-in-time delivery, it's not going to be just the plants in Oshawa and Windsor. It's going to be in Ohio and Michigan. And when those plants get closed down and those jobs start going, and in a very short order after that, we know an auto sector job is, I think, credited to 7 other spin-off jobs that are supported in, the auto sector in itself. If that happens, what the hell happens there? So I can't see Trump ignoring that for very long. So the auto sector absolutely has got huge impact, especially in Ontario, but it's going to have an impact right across the country. And I think it's going to have a big enough impact in the United States on jobs. Remember, Ohio, that's J.D. Vance country. They're going to have to pay attention if the auto plants get closed that quickly. And I can't see, Flavio Volte from the Automotive Manufacturer Parts. So that's what they're saying, that this can only last a very short time before plants will be shut down and jobs will be lost.
Monique?
Yeah, no, Flavio Volpe, who's been on the file for a very long time and knows his stuff very well, has been saying this for all through the weekend and for weeks leading up to this, that this is going to have a huge impact, that the auto manufacturers are going to press pause until they figure out where we're going from here. Certainly, this is part of the end game that Trump is trying to engineer, and that's to reshore auto manufacturing to the United States. He talked about it in his press conference this afternoon. He was talking about more manufacturing in Tennessee and bringing the manufacturing back to Alabama and South Carolina. And then he talked about European cars and bringing those ones. Why are we importing Mercedes-Benz and Volvos and Volkswagens? I mean, he went after everybody this afternoon. But certainly that's part of his end game, is to try and reshore a bunch of jobs to the U.S., not just North America, but to the U.S. And I think that is an existential threat to our auto sector for sure.
So, Tim, at what point, where's the balance? And I'm probably asking a question you won't actually know the answer to, but where's the balance in terms of the political calculus, if there's such a thing, for Donald Trump to say, I've got mileage up until this point, as Keith points out, because we're going to see job losses. One, the other side of this is ramping up capacity to offset those job losses. So, his phrase around, there'll be short-term pain, but people will understand it. I don't know that we know the answer to that, but that has to be part of this conversation.
I'm not sure to what extent he really thinks all of this through, right? Because there's 10%, 5%,
saying it out loud,
25%, February 1st. I think it's gut. And while it's nonstop Trump coverage here in Canada, on the American side, we're now in the news. We weren't anywhere. So sometimes I think we overestimate how much they actually think through Canada. That's my theory anyway. I again, on the notion that Trump is, you need to take him seriously, but not literally. A 25% tariff would be just so disruptive to the American supply chain. And you and Keith just walked through the impacts in Michigan and Ohio, two very important states of the Republicans that, they hope to capture a Senate seat. They're very close to Michigan last time around. I think this is really about taking a stand, getting some kind of deal that he can sell to the red hats, and then, focus on more important international issues, as opposed to fentanyl pouring across the border from Canada, which is really, again, a phantom.
So one of the things I heard over the weekend, and it's facetious, but it kind of gets back to the first, bit of this conversation, Monique, on the weekend was, let's pull the plug on them, particularly in Pennsylvania, because all those people watching the Philadelphia Eagles on Super Bowl Sunday won't be able to watch the game. Or, there is that sense of fun about it, but there's a deep rooted, I don't know about you, Facebook groups popping up all over the place on how I can buy Canadian. I think that's going to actually play a role in turning heads on this side of the border, in terms of how we message this, in terms of what it is we, stand up for or stand up against.
I think there's definitely a rallying cry that's being heard. And I think, to the LCBO's credit, and note that I'm not giving credit to the premier here, but the LCBO as a corporation, had the signs by Canadian Alternatives or something that they're putting in the spaces of the empty spaces of the American products. I think that's sending a message, and I think people are going to tune into that message. And I think it is a rallying cry. In a space where I think Canadians, normal Canadians in my riding of Nipissing, who feel like, what can we do? Like, there's, what can I do as a person? If you tell me, okay, I can go and buy Canadian Club instead of Kentucky bourbon, I'm going to feel like, okay, I'm doing something for Canada.
Yeah, I think, Tim, that response we haven't seen like that as intensely in other situations, as far as this is concerned, vis-a-vis, any kind of economic tit for tat between the Americans and Canada. I think it underlines how serious it is.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of a parallel, and I can't off the top of it. Well, it is deadly serious, right? If this actually were to come to pass, it would knock us into recession, probably 2 to 3 points off growth, and handicap our ability to grow manufacturing jobs if we can't tap into the largest market on the planet. It does reinforce a Canadian pride. It is probably ultimately healthy to know more about Canadian products we can have back home. But I will confess on the ledge, I did stock up with 3 bottles of bourbon on Saturday.
I was thinking of you.
Tim?
I know.
Didn't you hear me earlier? Irish whiskey is very close to Kentucky bourbon.
If I come to your fridge, I better not see any Florida oranges, young man. I mean, come on.
I love my oranges too. It's so sad.
Come on.
You border people, that's the issue. You're just too close to the border.
But ultimately, the more we can communicate with Americans, right? The more we can, whatever leverage, average person to leaders, to business leaders, to industry associations, about the impact this will have on the American consumer and inflation. It was probably a good thing that the stock market took a pretty heavy dip when it opened up on Monday morning as well. That's going to be our route forward.
Well, listen, we'll leave it there. Lots to talk about. Monique Smith, we hope you'll come back. That was good to get your insights on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll definitely be back.
Indeed. Keith Leslie is here, and of course, Tim Hudak. They are the usual suspects here on the ledge, and they'll be back at it on Thursday in their regular spot. So that will be good. And just a reminder, if you are listening on the podcast apps, it's Apple, iHeart, Spotify, all of that. Of course, if you're listening there, you can also watch us on the YouTube. And what we'll try to do is we post them on my YouTube channel as well as LinkedIn and Facebook. So if you see it pop up into your feed, make sure to share it. And if you've got anything to say or to add to the show or the conversation and you want to have your say, go to my website, davetrafford.com. Click the talkback message there. And we've got room for you to have a 90-second comment. So you don't have to take the full 90 seconds, but hit the button, leave your message, and we'll be happy to pass it along. All right. All right. So that'll do it for us. Today is Monday, February the 3rd. The president and the prime minister are 3 minutes into their conversation if they're keeping their schedule. As we wrap things up on The Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast, the Daily edition.
This is SSN
Story Studio Network.